Hello, Professor Tzvi Novick. Thanks for being with me on Exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to see you. We're colleagues and we know each other for many years. We went to the same graduate school. We had a podcast that we should plug right at the outset called Mining Scripture, which is still available. That involves also our colleagues, Francesca Murphy and Munim Siri. Jewish, Catholic, and Muslim voices there. We're going to speak about a Jewish perspective on the New Testament, but also the Jewish background to the New Testament. So our episode will address topics, I think, of great interest, and it will deal a little bit with the Jewish assessments of the New Testament, then really turn to questions such as where does the concept of Messiah originate in Judaism, which is obviously central to the New Testament. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'll start with a brief introduction, and then we'll get to the opening questions. So everyone, Tzvi Novick is the Abrams Jewish Thought and Culture Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on early rabbinic literature from the first few centuries after Jesus and on liturgical poetry written by Jews in Roman Palestine prior to the Muslim conquest. He has also written extensively on the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and on Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, and we'll explain what that is, the Second Temple period. He's the author of many books and articles, but one that maybe is written for a more popular audience that people could and should buy is An Introduction to the Scriptures of Israel, History and Theology, published in 2018. Do you want to say anything about that book briefly?
Sure. Yes, I guess briefly, it's a book that comes out of my experience in teaching the introductory theology class at Notre Dame, Foundations of Theology, which covers the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the early church. And so this is kind of the thoughts about the situating the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, theologically, which means also historically, because those two fields are related. It's coming out of there, but intended for both for classroom use and also just for general audience interested in a theological introduction to the Hebrew Scriptures.
Great. And Professor Novick is working on a book again with Ehrman's on an introduction to Jewish theology. I think you told me from a Christian perspective, but basically like Jewish theology for Christians, or an introduction for Christians to Jewish theology.
Right. So, and that's also coming out of a course that I have taught many times, both at Notre Dame in South Bend and Notre Dame's campus in Jerusalem, on Christianity and Judaism. It's a course that covers both the history of Christian teachings about Judaism and an introduction to Jewish theology with attentiveness to the sorts of questions, the kinds of topics that would be of interest to someone coming from a Christian perspective. So, in short, kind of the essentials of what a Christian might be interested in, ought to know about Judaism, both what Christianity teaches about Judaism, has taught in the past, teaches now, and what Judaism is theologically.
Can I ask you about your experience teaching at Notre Dame at a Catholic university, being in Jewish studies and not being Catholic and all of that? Would you feel comfortable saying a word or two about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've found it to be a great place to teach Judaism. I mean, it's a place that is, in keeping with the post-Vatican II church, inviting place for Jews and for the teaching of Judaism. So I teach within the Department of Theology, of course, as you know, within the area of Christianity and Judaism in antiquity, a doctoral area that's conceived explicitly as one that sort of recognizes the importance of teaching Christianity in tandem with Judaism, or with awareness of the Jewish context from which it emerges, and with which it's engaged in conversation past the point of its emergence. And it's also, I think, it's been a pleasure to be teaching within a Department of Theology specifically, as opposed to the department where I was trained as and you as well, a Department of Religious Studies, which
Studies.
and of course a context that I really enjoyed and appreciated. But there is an important difference between those two contexts, where Department of Religious Studies is essentially studying religion as a historical artifact, as a sociological artifact, where a social artifact, whereas the Department of Theology is devoted to studying Christianity, studying Judaism as systems of thought and a system that makes certain truth claims, a certain perspective about the world around the world, and so it's been great and particularly meaningful, I suppose, to be teaching Judaism within a Department of Theology, setting aside kind of the specifically Christian aspect of it.
Right, right. So you alluded to a course that you teach at Notre Dame, Foundations of Theology, and in that context, you teach New Testament as well. What's that like? Coming from outside of Christianity, but teaching New Testament, do you feel like I don't know, it's awkward? Like I've got mostly Christian students. What am I doing here? Or do you feel like, no, coming from my perspective, I can actually offer them something that they might not know, might not realize? What is the whole thing like?
Right. Well, so yeah, I mean, I'd say some students come in with significant background in New Testament, in the New Testament, but many
Not all of them.
yeah, many do not.
Yes.
But in any case, right, there's certainly New Testament is something that I studied in the course of my doctoral studies because the New Testament is a very important witness to early Judaism, and the focus of my doctoral work was Judaism, rabbinic Judaism of the first centuries of the Common Era, and so the New Testament is very important as a corpus produced within that very same Jewish context, or perhaps somewhat different. I guess we can get into that, but certainly it was something that I studied in that context, and I suppose that will be part of the conversation today. But a broader understanding of the Jewish context that precedes the emergence of the New Testament, that is occurring outside of the New Testament, in documents preserved within other forms of Judaism. Those all very much illuminate the New Testament, and so certainly I think, I've got kind of something to teach even for students who have read and know the New Testament well, to be able to situate it in that context, and that's important not just in terms of the historical context, but for understanding the theological claims being advanced by the Gospels like Paul.
Well, what about a Jewish assessment of the New Testament, and maybe avoiding for now theological questions? So obviously, there are profound differences about Jesus and the church between Jews and Christians. But the New Testament as sort of a work of literature, religious literature, I don't know if you want to give your perspective on it, things you like, things you think are, not the best, or maybe add in just general observation. What did Jews think of the New Testament?
Right, well, I'd say that in general, both today and over the centuries, the Jews have been largely ignorant of the New Testament. I mean, there's this goes to the basic asymmetry in the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, where Christianity, of course, recognizes its roots in the Old Testament, takes the God of Israel to be the very same God whom they worship, so that Judaism is an essential part of the story of Christianity, whereas that's not the same. In the opposite direction, Christianity has been a very determinative kind of historical fact for the development of Jewish thought. Jews have lived in Christian lands, from the emergence of such a thing as a Christian land, not exclusively. Of course, Jews have also lived in Muslim lands from the emergence of Islam. So Christianity is an important historical context for understanding the development of Jewish theology, but Judaism doesn't understand itself to be kind of structurally, as it were, dependent on or in relation theologically in a kind of an essential way to Christianity, in the way that Christianity does in relation to Judaism, and that's meant that Jews largely. Yeah, so that Jews
I just think that's a really important perspective. Sorry to jump in, but sure. In a sense, and some of the viewers for this YouTube channel may be coming from the background of Islamic studies, and all of this may be new, but I mean, right, for Christian theology, Christian theology must be done in conversation with the Old Testament, and with Jewish tradition that is part of the New Testament as well. But from a Jewish perspective, you don't have. There's no reason why you have to do theology in conversation with the New Testament or Christian thought.
Right, right. And so if one is interested as a Jew in kind of understanding history theologically, then the fact of Christianity, its emergence, its success, its impact on the world stage is something that one wants to theologically account for. But that's sort of a niche kind of thing. It doesn't belong to the center at all of the Jewish canon, of Jewish educational practices. So it's the New Testament is not something that Jews will study.
And it doesn't come up. I mean, Judaism is, of course, very diverse, different branches, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to summarize, but I mean, can you somehow try to say, like, does it come up in conversation in, I don't know, in Hebrew school, in any other context, like, oh, like the New Testament is, not a great piece of literature. It's not even good Greek, or like some of the stories are this or that, or maybe there's positive things like, oh, there's wisdom, like Jesus had wisdom, or Paul had some wisdom, or I don't know.
Right. Well, I'd say largely, I mean, largely it doesn't come up. I mean, it's simply not studied. I mean, in addition to the fact that there isn't a kind of a dependence on Christianity theologically, that asymmetry that we just spoke of, there's also a matter of the history of Christian anti-Judaism,
yes,
persecution under Christianity, that has made historically, things have changed now with all sorts of changes in modernity and changes within parts of the church. But historically, anyhow, this history of Christian anti-Judaism evolving into anti-Semitism has made Christianity also kind of a taboo. And there's
okay, that's very interesting.
And so it's not simply that one doesn't need to study the New Testament in order to understand Judaism, but that it's kind of seen as problematic to be studying it. There's also the question of conversionary pressure that is discouraged. Again, we're speaking to some extent of something that was thankfully sort of passed from the stage in many contexts for the church. But those conversionary pressures have also made the study of it something taboo. So this has changed somewhat over the course of the Jews began to study the New Testament more seriously in the 19th century. I would say beginning in the 19th century, and then into the 20th century, there would be Jews who engaged with the New Testament to a certain extent. Even the scion of a famous rabbinic family, the Soloveitchik family. This figure, Elijah Tzvi Novick, who wrote a commentary on the Gospels. But that's quite unusual. But certainly there's been in modernity and kind of as part of the emergence of Jews or the integration of the Jewish communities within Christian lands into a larger public. There has been interest in the figure of Jesus, recovering Jesus as a Jew. And also a certain, and recovering Jesus as a Jew with an important moral message, and also, of course, a great interest in Paul. I mean, for me, reading Paul is just an amazing exegete. Paul is an amazing reader of Scripture, a very clever reader of Scripture, very powerful reader of Scripture, very powerful rhetorician. So the experience of reading Paul for me has been, and studying Paul, has been very, very.
I want to just point out quickly, and we'll move on to the Jewish background of the Gospels and Paul and his letters. But I just want to note that your description of the Jewish experience in regard to the New Testament strikes me as parallel, and no parallels are exact, but generally parallel to what I've seen of Arab Christian attitudes to the Quran. In various countries, including countries like Egypt, where you have very significant Christian presence, but just overshadowed by a much larger Muslim presence, very religious country. So Islam is all around, and you hear the call to prayer and the Friday sermon on loudspeakers. And nevertheless, my general experience, I'm sure there are lots of exceptions, is that Christians there is a sort of taboo towards studying the Quran. And excuse me, and I've seen that in other Arab countries as well. And there's definitely conversionary pressure that has not gone away. That's still, a fact of life for Christians and I think most Muslim countries, but at least in the Arab Middle East. So that's interesting. And the response of many Christian communities is just avoid the Quran completely.
Right. I think, that's an interesting analogy. And in the Jewish context, I think there's also, the matter of seeing in the New Testament perhaps not in itself, but certainly as it's been read, a kind of taking up or a appropriation, say, of the story of Israel, of our own story, quote unquote, as Jews. So and that has been also, of course, this goes under the rubric of the term supersession, the idea of church replacing Israel. So again, I think that's for much of the New Testament that's not a fair characterization, but certainly as it's been understood, that's what the New Testament looks like, and so that also.
And one could see how problematic that would be for a Jewish reader. That's a very complicated subject. Okay, so turning to the New Testament itself, Christians take for granted very often this idea that Jesus is the Messiah or Jesus is the Christ. They may not always know that they're the same word, Christ, having passed through Greek, and Messiah coming to English and other modern languages right from Hebrew. Arabic, of course, is similar. Al-Masih, also coming ultimately from Hebrew. But actually, I think Christians will be surprised to find out that the Messiah is not a prominent idea or term or character in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. If you start looking through your Bible concordance for Messiah in the Old Testament, you're not going to find much. So it's a big topic, but why in the Gospels give you the impression that like everyone is wondering about this, like when is the Messiah going to come? Who is the Messiah? This is like, the big question in the Gospels, maybe especially synoptic Gospels, that the Gospel writers are communicating in regard to Jesus. Like, could this be the one? Is he the Messiah? John the Baptist from prison asks a question, are you the Messiah? And then Jesus responds with something from the prophets, all of this. So could you just, I don't know, as briefly as you can do while still doing justice to the topic, explain, where does the concept of a Messiah originate, and was it actually important to all Jewish movements in the first century, or is this just something we find in the Gospels?
Okay, yeah. So, right, definitely a big topic. I'd say so. If we're talking about Messiah in relation to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and so Hebrew Mashiach, the main place to look is the figure of David. So Mashiach or Christ indicates someone who is anointed, so someone on whom oil has been spread by way of designating them for as holy, as dedicated to a holy task. It's not something that is exclusively done for the dedication of kings, like it's also done for a high priest, but or at least the Aaronite high priest. But the concept, when we're thinking about, or we're tracing back the concept to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament, we're thinking about this Davidic king. So, and maybe I have a Hebrew Bible on me. So let's see. So in the book of Samuel, that's when David appears, and He's not the first king of Israel. He is the second after Saul. And when the prophet Samuel, so the prophet Samuel is seeking him out to anoint a successor to King Saul. And so here's the verse, and maybe it'll be helpful to read it in Hebrew to get a sense of if we want to situate things in the Jewish background. So Vayikach Shmuel et keren hashemen, vayimshach oto bekerev achav, vatitzlach ruach Hashem el David, mehayom hahu v'ma'ala. So Samuel took the horn of oil, and he anointed Vayimshach, Mashiach, Messiah, Vayimshach oto. So he anointed him in the midst of his brothers, his other brothers, the sons of Jesse there. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And so this is a scene that should be familiar to readers of the New Testament from the very beginning of what scholars take to be the earliest gospel historically, the Gospel of Mark. We have the scene of Jesus' baptism. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan, and then as he's coming up out of the water, he sees the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him.
Form of the dove.
Right, and so this idea of kind of being pure. Here, it's not oil that's placed on Jesus; it's baptism, but that is so immersion in water, but that's accompanied by the descent of the Spirit. So that is kind of inspired by this scene of David being anointed, and then the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David from that day forward. And then the continuation of that baptism story, what happens is Jesus hears this voice from heaven saying, "You are my son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." And that is an allusion to Psalm 2, so the Psalms, many Psalms are about, the Psalms as a whole are attributed to David. Certain Psalms are about the Davidic king. And here at the very beginning of the book of Psalms, we have God saying to David, it's a scene of enemies besieging God and Mishicho and his Messiah. And then God says to this Messiah, B'ni ata, ani hayom yilidticha. You are my son. Today I have born you, or have begotten you. And so that baptism scene in Mark is bringing together the scene of David's anointing and the statement that God makes to his Mashiach, to this Davidic king, that king is his son.
Psalm 2.
In Psalm 2. That's right. So it's bringing together 1 Samuel 16 and Psalm 2. So there you have really kind of the core idea of the Messiah lies in this tradition of a Davidic king who is inspired by God, who is in a certain sense, or even quite literal sense, I suppose, the son of God. Maybe we have adoption language being taken here, that God kind of adopts David as his son. So that's the deep, I suppose, background to this figure of the Messiah. Now, the Messiah, there we have in 1 Samuel, in the figure of David, we have the Messiah as a historical figure. This idea of the Messiah as a horizon of expectation, as someone to be anticipated, that's something that emerges with the phenomenon of exile. Right? So when Israel is exiled, when the kingdom of Judah in particular is defeated by the Babylonians, the temple is destroyed, that creates the expectation of restoration. And a crucial aspect of that restoration is the Davidic monarchy. And we have to imagine, it's a really striking thing, but the Davidic monarchy continued unbroken from the time of David through to the Babylonian exile. So for roughly 400 years or so, that's in contrast to the other kingdom, the Israelite, the northern kingdom, that had many dynastic lines. But here we're talking about a dynastic line that lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. And so the expectation with the exile was of restoration, including restoration of this Davidic figure, and with all of the mythic elements and the exalted elements that came to surround that figure.
Even though I mean, first of all, the institution of a king in Israel with Saul is already sort of, I mean, we could really enter into a discussion of scripture here. But I mean, the institution of the kingship with Saul is already sort of presented in an ambiguous manner, that the people are yearning for a king. And then David himself is a problematic figure in terms of his moral righteousness. And yet, nevertheless, the Davidic monarchy is anticipated to be restored. And
Right. So for sure, the Hebrew Bible as a whole is ambivalent about kings, right? Where the king is someone that gets in the way, is not so much a mediator between the people and God, but an obstacle between the people and God, and someone who is liable to get the people of Israel implicated in, connected to foreign kingdoms and their gods. And so, yeah, there's definitely a certain ambiguity about that. And it's not the case that one finds visions of the restoration of Israel following the Babylonian exile that don't necessarily center on the Davidic king. So we can't necessarily think of all visions of restoration as centered on the Davidic king, but that certainly is an important motif. And then, of course, there is a return from the Babylonian exile, but it seems to have been kind of generally understood that, or anyhow, a prevalent idea that this restoration is not the restoration we've been hoping for.
Okay, that's a really important point. I think that's missed by a lot of students of the Bible, maybe Christians especially, that there's ambiguity, almost disappointment about what happens with the Second Temple, and it's not seen as the same as the first, and probably more than that.
So Israel is restored under Persia. A second temple is built, but Israel remains. There remains a large diaspora. So Israel hasn't been kind of gathered, as it were, back to its land. Israel remains subject. The kingdom, or the land of Israel, remains subject to imperial powers, first Persian, then Greek, and then afterward Roman. And so this expectation of restoration that begins with the Babylonian exile. There are, of course, there's a sort of hope of restoration, or a return to a utopia that's even deeper than the Babylonian exile. And the very idea of exile from the garden kind of suggests a hope for restoration. But the hope of restoration.
Can I just explain? Ask for a bit more on that. So you're alluding to maybe a more spiritualized, or is it more like apocalyptic idea that maybe competes with the idea of the Messiah as a new David, or the restoration as a restoration of the Davidic monarchy, one which centers on the vision of the garden as maybe God's ultimate or original primary plan for humanity?
Right. Okay. Well, yes. So I was just suggesting that there's certainly a lot more to say about competing visions, apocalyptic visions, kind of rootedness in Adam, but just that there's a kind of an instinct toward kind of a horizon of expectation, hope, utopia, and restoration that's sort of built into the structure of the Hebrew Bible. With the beginning, Eden, and the expulsion from it, that's maybe even deeper than the historical circumstances of exile and foreign domination. But I do want to, I should certainly get to that, because so we've got this restoration, but it's understood to be only a partial restoration. There is what to be hoped for, and for many, that hope does involve the idea of a Davidic king, independence from empires. So there is a turn that happens. To some extent. Well, okay. So I guess here. So okay, if we're thinking about the deep background of the Messiah, one vector is the Davidic king, the loss of that kingdom, and the hope for its restoration. Then we have the second vector that's going to intersect with it, and that is really, it's about myth. So when I say myth, I mean like stories about God or stories about the divine, right? So in Greek myth, we've got all sorts of relationships and conflicts among divine figures. And we don't really have that in the Hebrew Bible because we just have one God. So the action isn't really happening in heaven. The action is happening on earth, and God is interested in that, obviously, and related to that. But there isn't much action happening in heaven. There aren't really heavenly figures that approach to God. The angels are all nameless. There is no cosmic opponent of God, so there isn't much in the way of conflict. But there are allusions to myths in the Hebrew Bible that are preserved. There are these giants in the antediluvian, like the pre-flood period. There's this figure Enoch who lives 365 years and then is taken by God. There are there's this Satan figure in the book of Job. So somehow or other, you have these mythic motifs that are there in a subterranean way, presumably circulating outside of the Bible. And as we advance in the Second Temple period, these ideas start to emerge into literature that has survived. And the latest of the books of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Daniel, the second half of the book of Daniel, is very much interested in these. And so here you get this idea of, well, a figure, a heavenly figure that is very close to God, quite like God, God-like in many different ways, or really a God in a certain sense. So you have most famously in Daniel chapter 7 this vision of God and the Son of Man figure who is affiliated with God. And then you also have in Daniel this robust kind of return of myth, battles between the angels who are the heavenly equivalents of imperial powers on the one hand, and angelic figures who now are named on the other hand. And so they're real powers. And so we have this reemergence of myth. And this is going to be important in kind of thinking about the emergence of the Messiah as we know it from the New Testament, because, of course, in Jesus, we have someone who is not only a descendant of David and represents the restoration of a Davidic monarchy, but also the Son of God. And more than in the kind of that's also part of the story of David. You are my son. God tells David in the Psalm 2, but that seems more like in an adoptive sense. But then with this emergence of myth, of stories about God, stories about what's happening in heaven, traditions about divine figures who are related to God and cosmic opponents of God. So here we're going to get the emergence of a messianic figure and the expectation of a messianic figure who isn't just a long lost or a descendant of David, but who is really a son of God in a divine sense, in a real divine sense. And so there's a lot more to say about that and about apocalypse and the apocalypse myth, but we can fill that out.
Can I throw in a quick question, which in a sense is a tangent and kind of takes us off course a little bit? We'll circle back to the first century and to the New Testament. But when Jews think today about the Messiah, is it the Davidic kind? Is it the mythic, divine, or semi-divine, or something like that kind? Or is it both, or something else?
Yeah, great question.
21st century Jewish thought about the Messiah.
Yeah. Which century, I'm sorry?
This century, 21st century.
Yeah. Okay. Those are first to 21st. Those are very different. So certainly there is messianic expectation, of course, in Judaism. So Judaism emerges largely from the figures of the rabbis. Judaism, as we know it today, is the work largely of the figures of the rabbis of the early centuries of the Common Era, and they preserve a form of that same messianic expectation that you see in the New Testament. And it is, I guess, embodied maybe most dramatically in the Amidah. Literally, that's a word meaning standing, but that refers to the foundational, the central prayer in Jewish liturgy, recited 3 times a day. And that includes prayers for well-being, for health, for prosperity, but it also includes prayers for the restoration of Israel. for the ingathering of exiles, for the rebuilding of the temple, and for the restoration of the Davidic kingdom and the Davidic king. So, so there is that hope, and that hope. Yeah, today I think right that there isn't it isn't sort of a burning aspect of Jewish religious life.
Okay.
The Messiah, the expectation of the Messiah, and who the Messiah is and what the Messiah will look like is not something that I would say preoccupies
So
Jews.
that could be like a Christianizing reading of Jewish life, to think that, oh, Jews must be thinking all the time about when is the Messiah coming, who he will be. And
Right. So yeah, so it's not. I mean, it isn't. It wouldn't be kind of wholly wrong to think of that as an important Jewish idea. It does figure importantly in this prayer that is recited 3 times a day. And there are Jews for whom kind of messianic expectation is important. There's a whole kind of phenomenon of messianism.
Well, there's the movement, the Lubavitcher Chabad movement, right? Which
yes.
I was living in New York City in the early 1990s, when we don't have to go there.
Right.
People can study on their own the Chabad, and I think there are different branches probably, and it gets complicated. But there was a proclamation of a Messiah in that movement, right?
Yes.
Maybe.
So, right. So yeah, there you do have messianic expectation being realized in the form of the identification of this particular person, Menachem Mendel Schneerson,
Right,
as
in Brooklyn, not in Jerusalem, but in Brooklyn, right?
Right, in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, right, even though he did pass away in 1994, but despite that, there are many Lubavitcher Hasidim who do take him to, who expect his return and take him to be the Messiah, and that's been, of course, controversial. So it is there. It is there, that expectation, but I wouldn't say it's a preoccupation of.
Okay. Let's circle back to the first century. Sorry for that tangent. And just a question that occurred to me out of my curiosity. In the first century, we hear about different movements within Judaism. Again, this may be a Christianizing reading. I may be reading this through the lens of the New Testament or later Christian thought, but people speak about, there are zealots around. So this was like one way of being a Jew. There were Essenes out in the desert in the Qumran community. And these categories are sometimes placed upon Jesus. So Jesus is sometimes argued by scholars to have, he was really a zealot, or he's really Essene, or apocalypticism was a thing. Everyone was expecting the end of the world. So could you speak a little bit about those categories, at least those three, zealots, Essenes, and apocalyptic folks, and whether it makes sense to identify Jesus within one of those categories?
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah. That also, a big question, but to some extent in continuity with this earlier conversation about the background to the idea of the Messiah. So, so in scholarship, we speak about the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, and the question there is, okay, Christianity emerges from a Jewish context. When can we speak of a distinct, two distinct religious formations, Christianity and Judaism, that have parted? And scholars have different takes on this. There are, as at least one, but I think multiple books, with the ways that never parted, lots of permutations of this. But one could say, obviously, all these things need to be nuanced and could be contested, but one could say that the ways parted already before Jesus, in the Second Temple period, in the sense that we have multiple different interpretations of Judaism, and the seeds, say, of distinct formations that we know today as Judaism and Christianity arguably lie in these distinct formulations and perspectives on Judaism in the Second Temple period, in this kind of the second half of the Second Temple period, these last two and a half centuries of the Second Temple period. And here, right, so the term apocalyptic is important. So if we think about, apocalyptic in relation to the Second Temple period, I mean, the word literally means revelation, to describe the kind of revelation of hidden secrets about what's going on in heaven and what the imminent future will look like. But when we're talking about apocalyptic currents in Judaism in this time, we're talking about this expectation that, or with the sense that there's something fundamentally out of sorts with the world, out of whack with the world. The world is under the control of forces of evil, and the evidence for that, the political manifestation. There's a political manifestation of that, namely in the fact that Israel is subject to these foreign powers, Greek, and then of course most especially the persecution of Judaism under Antiochus, and then under Rome. So it has a political manifestation. It has a physical manifestation in the form of illness, and so someone who is capable of healing miraculously is really someone who is battling those cosmic powers. And then it has also a manifestation, a spiritual manifestation in the form of sin. And so there's a sense that the world is fundamentally out of whack, fundamentally kind of got wrong, really from the beginning almost, because one can trace then what we see in the political realm and the human realm really has these deep roots of the cosmic realm in the reign of Satan or Belial.
By engaging with these sorts of themes, motifs, the New Testament authors might actually be apocalyptic, even when they're not actually speaking about the last day or the day of judgment.
Well, right. So the prominence of Satan, say in some of these gospel narratives, of course, right, Jesus is casting out demons, and he is explicitly engaged, as it were, with the prince of demons, with Beelzebul. This famous notion of the house divided against itself is a reference to the house of demons, so that the authority of the demonic realm over the world. So when we're speaking about that sort of perspective on the world, that is part of it belongs to, in a general sense, this apocalyptic perspective, and so you see it.
Can I ask about? There's another question that's just my curiosity. It compels me to ask. As a Jewish reader, seeing the devil relatively prominent, I mean, it's not like he's in every chapter of the Gospels, but I mean, for example, at least two of the Synoptic Gospels have the story of Jesus being led out into the desert and tempted by the devil. As a Jewish reader, is that just like weird? Like, why this focus on the devil? And
right. Well, I mean, it does. I mean, as a Jewish reader, kind of formed by rabbinic Judaism. So Judaism, as we know it today, as I mentioned, right, is really Judaism that is given its direction by the rabbis of these first centuries of the Common Era, the authors of the Talmud and other rabbinic texts. And so reading that story, from the perspective of the Judaism formed then, of course, I'm also coming to it as a scholar of the period, so it's more familiar to me. But certainly, it is odd, right? So within Judaism, sin is generally thought of as something, a matter of human choice, and it's not something to which one is enslaved or to which the world is enslaved, but it's something that one can overcome. There is an inclination to sin. There is a Satan. There is a figure Satan. I mean, he appears in the book of Job. One can't, even if you just are holding to the Old Testament, you have to have a Satan, not just in the book of Job, also in the prophecy of Zechariah. And so there is a figure of Satan, someone who tempts to sin, but it's not really so much a cosmic power, something that we need saving from, but rather a human inclination that human beings are capable of overcoming. So that aspect of it does kind of stand out as different. It's difficult to know, when we're talking about the parting of the ways, perhaps between Judaism and Christianity beginning before Jesus, right? In a sense, this would be on the understanding that, on the one hand, Christianity is emerging from a form of Judaism that is more informed by this apocalyptic worldview.
Right,
And
right.
Judaism, as we know it today, is emerging from a different form of Judaism, less informed by that. That could be associated perhaps with this school of thought, the Pharisees. But this involves a lot of speculative reconstruction, speculative because we don't really know much about the Pharisees when we're talking about the deep roots of Judaism as we know it today. We have gaps. We have the rabbis who are living after Jesus, not so long after Jesus, but somewhat after Jesus, and they claim as ancestors certain figures who are known to be Pharisees, but tracing the deep roots of Judaism as we know it today, a lot of speculation.
Easier said than done. And then what about the Essenes? So in sort of painting the landscape of Judaism at the time of Jesus, I mean, people may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of a spot called Qumran near the Dead Sea. I don't even know if the Essenes were actually there. People assume that's the case. I don't know if that's actually correct. But, you know, I think most Christians at least just have vague ideas that they were there. They may have heard that people think maybe John the Baptist was an Essene, maybe because he's at the Jordan River and he liked baptizing, and the Essenes washed themselves a lot through ablutions.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, how do they fit into this landscape?
Yeah. So, right. So we have the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, and then we know of this sect called the Essenes from Josephus, from Philo, from witnesses from the end of the Second Temple period, and just after, in the case of Josephus as well, who tell us about these different sects. And most scholars, I think it's fair to say, assume a particularly close connection between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes, and I would agree with that. But the Dead Sea Scrolls really open an amazing window onto Judaism of this period, and in part onto the circles in which Jesus moved, and whether we can identify John the Baptist as an Essene, how close a connection we can draw between the circle of Jesus followers and the Essenes. Those are kind of difficult questions to come to definitive answers about, but there's no doubt that the Dead Sea Scrolls illuminate the period and specifically illuminate the thought of Jesus. And I'll give one example. So Jesus, of course, sort of famously in the Sermon on the Mount comes out against divorce.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe
it has been told to you, or Moses wrote that writ may be obtained for a man to divorce his wife, but I tell you, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but yeah.
Right. So yeah, so I'll just read. Right, we're talking about from the again, if we take the Gospel of Mark 10, and some Pharisees ask, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And interestingly, right, so this is presented as a Pharisaic challenge to Jesus. And what did Moses command you? Jesus asks, and they say Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce. That's what we find in Deuteronomy. And then Jesus replies, "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law, but at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother to be unified with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so, therefore, what God has joined together, no one separate." So we find here Jesus taking this position against divorce. Interesting, you know, what do we do with the book of Deuteronomy? But Jesus attributes that to the hardness of hearts.
And this seems like a maybe radical, at least an unusual opinion for a Jewish teacher to have, because I mean, presumably almost all the other Jewish teachers at the time would have recognized the law clearly teaches that divorce is possible under certain circumstances.
Right. Well, and that's precisely where the Dead Sea Scrolls become interesting, okay. Right? So I'm reading here. This is there's Dead Sea Scrolls are conveniently collected in a study edition, a 2-volume study edition. So I'm reading here from the Damascus document. So one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was strikingly discovered not only at Qumran, but also having been copied for centuries in a totally different place in the Cairo Giza. But this is the text over here. So it's describing how, so this is the sect speaking about how Israel has fallen into sins, the traps of sin, and they've fallen into, in particular, the trap of zinut, fornication. How? Lakachat shte nashim b'chayehem, to take two women in their lives, meaning that their wife is still alive, their first wife is still alive, and yet they have taken another woman. This refers either to bigamy. It's understood by scholars probably to be referring both to bigamy and especially to divorce, or more precisely, marriage after divorce. V'yisod habriya, and the foundation of creation is zachar u'nekeva bara otam, male and female, he created them. Right, so this sect from the Dead Sea is saying the foundation of creation is male and female, he created them, and therefore this idea of taking a second wife while the first is still alive, even if they've been divorced, is impermissible. So, and that term Yesod Habriya, the foundation of creation, seems very much related to Jesus' words in Mark 10, but at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So it seems to be a very close conversation between this position that Jesus takes here on divorce, against divorce, and the one that we find at Qumran. And it reflects, interestingly, it also goes to a certain extent toward an apocalyptic worldview, because right, the apocalyptic tendency is to draw all things back to creation, right? So our present circumstances are not just the historical circumstances that we're situated in, but reflects a divine plan that originates in creation and that will culminate in an imminent end time. So that's kind of the dynamic of apocalyptic thought. And so while this seems to be unrelated to that, it's just a debate about divorce, but really it's a debate about the nature of the law, right? Is the law a means of creating a good human society that can operate and live with God and kind of realize God's kingdom in this world? Or is it really about nature and about essences? And so for Jesus here in Mark 10, and for the sect in this Damascus document, the law of marriage is really rooted in some essential idea of male and female, and perhaps predestination. We have a lot of indications of that from Qumran, of the idea that the person whom you marry is someone whom you are destined to marry. You ought to be taking their horoscope to determine that they're the one that is suited for you. And so it's a rooting of law in nature rather than in a kind of social covenant, social/theological covenant.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, see your perspective, or how that could inform one's understanding of Jesus's teaching on ethical, legal questions. But I mean, you're not saying Jesus was an Essene.
Oh no! I don't. I really. I mean, there's some who claim that. I mean, placing Jesus is difficult. Someone would place him actually, ironically, sort of close to the Pharisees, and would explain, sometimes the strongest tensions are among those who are closest to each other. But here we do have clear evidence of a connection, anyhow, between this Qumranic sectarian position and Jesus. But I think, right, we just have to think of the situation of the time being messy, being one in which kind of lines can be, a whole kind of range of different groups where there's overlap and conflict. And right, no, I certainly wouldn't go so far as to identify Jesus as an Essene.
I want to make sure we get to Paul, but before we leave sort of the landscape of Judaism in the first century in Palestine, could we speak a little bit more about the political context in Second Temple Judaism? Actually, I want to ask about two things. I'm not sure where to start, but we have a lot of scenes of Jesus going to the temple in the Gospels. And I mean, the Gospels sort of paint a picture of Jewish religious life, different festivals. Maybe in John it's more prominent than the Synoptic Gospels, but you could comment on that. Could you just maybe describe in a bit more detail the main features of Jewish religious life in the Second Temple? Do the Gospels basically get it right, or do they maybe intentionally emphasize certain things in order to better make their case, or something like that?
Right. I mean, so we do. Yeah. I mean, the Gospels are a very important kind of witness to, from an historical perspective, they're a really important witness to um, uh, Jewish life uh, in this Roman province at the end of what we call the Second Temple period. Uh, and yeah, certainly the temple is a very central feature of it. The temple is obviously both the house of God and with its great theological significance, and then it's also
Even though you sort of suggested, unless I misunderstood you, that people also were like, well, this is a second temple, it's not quite as good. Maybe the ark is no longer there, and other things about it are not as great. It's smaller and stuff like that.
right. Well, there is the hope of a greater restoration, but certainly the temple is yeah, the center of religious life. Also, by this point, it's no longer so small, right? It's been expanded.
Oh, because there was the Herodian.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So the scene of Jesus, for example, as you know, people usually describe it, clearing out the temple. Is it clearing out the temple? What's the phrase people
right.
use?
Yeah. Yeah.
Clearing out the temple, overturning tables, money changers, things like that. I mean, obviously, the gospel authors make this a sort of climactic scene leading up to his crucifixion. All of this. I mean, that presumably reflects that actually at this time in first century Palestine, the temple was super important to Jewish life.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, pilgrimage. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say that the temple is essential not just theologically but also economically. When we think about
Okay.
the temple, right? So the temple is a major economic nexus, major inflows of funds to the temple. And so, no, absolutely. I mean, we know from other evidence from Josephus the role of the temple, the role of pilgrimage festivals, both as a kind of major phenomenon in Jewish life, and also as politically tense moments. These are moments of potential violence when you have so many people gather to the temple. This is something that's not entirely unfamiliar to us from
And
21st
sorry to jump in. Can I get something in really quickly? So
yes.
just because we have a lot of viewers who know Islam and the Quran, the Arabic word is Hajj for the pilgrimage to Mecca. In Hebrew, is it Hajj? Is that right? Something like that?
Chag, yeah, Chag or Hajj. Yeah, that's right. So that's right. So the pilgrimage festival is Chag, and these are times when you have enormous crowds at the time of Jesus. And again, we have the evidence for this from elsewhere, um, uh, chiefly from Josephus. But these are times when you have enormous crowds around the temple, and yeah, so there are tense times, there are intense times. So yeah, so it definitely is giving us. I mean, it's giving us a generally kind of accurate picture of Jewish life in at this time, and then also it's giving us it's giving us details. I mean, there are. I mean, this is another. It's a bit of a complicated example, but and it's not immediately centered on the temple, but but if we think about another debate in the Gospel of Mark that this parallels elsewhere in the Synoptic Gospels is this debate about hand washing. And so here you have kind of insight into the spread of new purity practices in Judaism. And so we have a tractate in the Mishnah, in this foundational rabbinic text, about the purity of hands and hand washing. But this is not something that you don't find this in the Bible. This idea of the importance of washing hands for the sake of maintaining the purity of the body. And we see it as kind of an innovation in rabbinic literature. The rabbis struggle to kind of explain the logic of this innovation, but we get some real insight into the nature of this innovation, specifically from the New Testament. So in ways large and small, we really have a window here into Jewish life, Jewish religious life in the late second period.
I wonder, maybe a connection, probably people have written about this, about ablutions in the Islamic tradition also, which are part of prayer practice.
Right.
Okay, I want to ask one more thing about the temple, but it's escaping me now. Did you want to add in something else before I turn to Paul?
Sure. Let's we can't forget Paul.
Okay, maybe I'll circle back to the temple if I can remember. But yeah, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but very briefly, you alluded to Paul already as an exegete or a commentator on Hebrew Bible Old Testament. I thought I'd ask about one particular image. I just remembered the thing I was trying to remember. One particular image about Paul. Let's stick with this first, and then I'll try to circle back afterwards with that other thought. Which is in Romans. He, oh gosh, around, I don't know, chapters 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there. I mean, after his discourse about Abraham and faith in the law, he speaks about a law written on the heart. And he speaks about the Gentiles keeping the law. That might actually be earlier. I think that's actually maybe Romans 2.
Yeah.
Is Romans 2. Okay. So I just thought maybe that's an interesting question, but you might have another example from Paul's writing that it sort of manifests how he's a Jewish thinker. But I just thought, I mean, that's an interesting point for me because he's thinking about a law for the Gentiles as well. He speaks of them of having the law of their hearts, so some sort of natural notion of God's commandments for humanity. Is that a typical Jewish move to think about the law both in the Mosaic way and then in some other way which either transcends or at least captures the law for non-Jews?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so yeah, I mean, there's so much. I mean, Paul is when we turn to Paul, of course, we've been speaking largely about the situation of Jews um, in uh, in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, in Roman Palestine, Judea. But then when we turn to Paul, we're turning to someone who was writing in Greek, someone who is from Asia Minor, and so we need to think about um, the larger Greco-Roman world, and there's a very large population of Jews living in this world, speaking Greek. Outside of Paul, the most famous figure among them is presumably Philo, living in Alexandria in the first century.
Is it generally assumed that Jews in that context, sort of Greek-speaking Jews outside of Palestine or the land of Israel, that they do religion in a different way?
So the kind of there was in scholarship kind of this construct of Hellenistic Judaism, right? So Judaism that is distinctive as being Hellenistic, as being kind of from the Greek world, and then there's the pushback to that as being overdrawn. So it's something I think one needs to kind of keep in mind. Language, culture makes a difference. So yeah, so if you're thinking and speaking in Greek, then you certainly are going to be inclined maybe toward different sets of metaphors, toward different frames of reference than if you're speaking in other contexts. If you're further from the temple, you're going to maybe have different sets of priorities than closer to it. Though again, not necessarily in ways one would think. The temple might be larger, ironically, for those who are further away from it and it has a mythic stature than for those who are immediately next to it. So things can be complicated that way. But yeah, so it's a difference to think about, but it also could be overdrawn. So yes, so you mentioned this idea of the law on the hearts, right? So in his preoccupation with the law and his interest in the law, of course, Paul is very much situated within Judaism more broadly. This idea of the law on the heart is already, one finds it in Deuteronomy, and Paul cites this verse elsewhere. Moses says the matter is close to you, in your mouth and in your hearts, to do. So the idea of inscribing the law on the hearts is an old trope. Yeah, there's also this idea of the law or the Torah as a kind of pre-created wisdom. That's something that comes up in the Gospel of John. I mean, there are lots of directions to go with that. But Paul really, I mean, it's important. I mean, and this, I guess, goes toward this question of, are we thinking about a different sort of Judaism? There are these striking points of contact between Paul and the rabbis. And so the rabbis, a lot of what's characteristic about the way the rabbis think, that they're coming to the Torah in part through ways of thinking, through modes of argument that were cultivated in Greek rhetoric, and that's definitely part of what Paul is thinking about also. So maybe I'll just mention, and this is something that a scholar, Menachem Kister, has pointed to. But so in Romans 5, right? So this is where one of the passages where Paul is thinking about Christ in relation to Adam. And so he says, just as through one man sin came into the world, and through sin death, and so death came to all men because all men sinned. And then he says, but not like the trespass is the favor. For if many died through one man's trespass, how much more have the grace of God and the gift and the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. And so that kind of reasoning is something you see a sort of striking parallel to it. Here, I'll read the passage from this early rabbinic commentary on the book of Leviticus. So he says, this is Rabbi Yosef. He says, if you wish to know the reward that will be given to you, to the righteous in the world to come, you may learn this from Adam. He was given only one commandment, a prohibition, which he transgressed. And see how many deaths Adam was condemned to suffer as a result, his own and all of his descendants. Now, which divine measure is greater, the measure of divine benevolence or the measure of divine punishment? Certainly the measure of divine benevolence is greater. If then the lesser measure, that of punishment, resulted in Adam and his descendants being condemned to so many deaths, then someone who observes the commandments, how much more does that person acquire merit? So that this kind of way of thinking, this sort of reasoning through these methods that are very, very prevalent within Greek rhetoric, within Greek forensics, right, kind of court argumentation, sort of applying these tools of reasoning to Adam, to the Bible, in order to reason through, in Paul's case, about how do we understand this idea of the dying Messiah? How do we understand the crucifixion and the resurrection? But you see that same kind of application of these reasoning tools for the rabbis in thinking through God's providence.
Right. Okay. I'm going to ask just one more question. I'm going to skip the question that was related to the topic we were speaking about before Paul. I was going to circle back to baptism, but just on Paul, it's kind of a wild question to end on, so forgive me. But if we could have a contrary to fact exercise, I mean, do you think there is a coherent way? So, I mean, if Paul wanted to advance his understanding of Jesus as the Messiah, and I think Redeemer, but if you want to question that, go ahead. Was there a way for him to do that apart from adopting for the sake of that reading, the Old Testament and the history of Jewish thought? Could he have just broken away from all of that and said, something new has begun. We need to cast off this earlier legacy of the Hebrew scriptures and think in a new way? Was that even possible, or was the only way forward to advance his argument about Jesus through the Hebrew scriptures?
Well, first I should say that, it's important, I guess, to appreciate the degree to which, right, he really is faithful to the Hebrew scriptures. That they are kind of totally informing his worldview. This is scripture for him. There's no other scripture than the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament.
That's a good point.
But yes, for him, and nor does he, kind of readings of Paul kind of that see him as rejecting the law as evil. Those are ones that are really scholars have revised in light of kind of understanding Paul in his Second Temple context. Likewise, Jesus, the idea of Jesus being unfaithful to the law, also have been revised in light of understanding him in the Second Temple context. But to your question, in terms of the opposite extreme, could he have understood Jesus differently? Well, yes. And we find forms of Christianity that do reject the authority of the Bible. They need to grapple with the Bible, but they can read it totally against the grain and take the Bible to be the work of an evil creator God. This is the heresy of Gnosticism, as it's sometimes called. But to take the Bible as the story of a creator God who is necessarily evil, because why would a good God entomb the divine spirit in decaying, dying matter? So the very idea of creation is evil. And
the divine spirit within each person, you mean?
Right. The divine spirit within each person. What kind of God, what kind of good God would encase that divine spirit in this decaying, dying world? And so, uh, and so, just as the serpent came to undermine that creator God and bring wisdom to Adam and Eve and tell them, you are not this earthly stuff that you're made of, but you come from some greater God, greater than that creator God. So too Jesus could be understood as another emissary from that same higher God, higher than the creator God. And so, right, so it's certainly what was possible to understand Jesus, uh, not only independent from the God of the Hebrew Bible, but actually coming to undermine the God of the Hebrew Bible. And people did do that. There were Christians who did do that. Um, and the affirmation of Paul's understanding of Jesus and the Gospel's understanding of Jesus is a refutation of or a rejection of that perspective on Jesus and the insistence. And really, this is kind of the fundamental commitment that determines the character of Christianity going forward. That our story is a continuation of the story of Israel and not a fundamental break from it. And the God whom we worship is the God of Israel. They're the same. So that was not a given. That's important to appreciate. I certainly, as a Jew, teaching at a Catholic university, appreciate. I mean, it's a remarkable thing, really. It is a remarkable thing. The idea of a religious identity that is so bound up with another people,
yes.
And this willingness to embrace that, where every human inclination would push toward rejecting that, to be kind of coming as the latecomer in someone else's story. It's not an easy thing to make sense of.
Mm-hmm.
And but Christianity in its emergence held to that despite the temptation to do other ones.
Yes. I think there are analogies being made about Islam's relationship with the Bible as well, or the Quran's relationship with the Bible, Islam's relationship with Judaism and Christianity, but maybe that'll be for another episode.
Oh yeah.
Just a reminder, everyone, please take a look at and buy An Introduction to the Scriptures of Israel, History and Theology by Professor Novick. So I'm sure you'll find that on various places online. Thank you, Tzvi. That was great. Thanks for sharing some of your time.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.